Classmates, good morning. I have the privilege of welcoming our distinguished speaker today. Lieutenant General Bob Otto is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, United States Air Force. As the Air Force's Senior Intelligence Officer, he is directly responsible to the Director of National Intelligence and the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and is responsible for policy formulation, planning, evaluation, oversight, and leadership of the Air Force's ISR capabilities. General Otto was commissioned in 1982 after graduating from the U.S. Air Force Academy. He is commanded at the Squadron, Group, and Wing, and prior to his current assignment, was the commander, Air Force ISR Agency, Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. His staff duties include 3 tours at Headquarters, U.S. Air Force, the Operations Director at Joint Staff, and Headquarters Air Education and Training Command. The General is a command pilot with more than 2,800 hours in a variety of aircraft, including the U-2, RQ-4, and F-15. Ladies and gentlemen, General Otto.
Wow, very impressive. I may just have you stand there for a little while. That's cool. Now, have a seat, please. Have a seat. So, first of all, it's great to be here chatting with all of you. I did not attend the Air Command and Staff College. I attended the Army's Command and General Staff College. It was so interesting when I was a student back in '93. That was now 23 years ago, right? And so think about that. You might have 23 years of service left to go before you're going to be able to hang up your uniform. And that's an incredible thing. The year I was there was the first year that any of our schools had a Russian attend. And so this is just after the fall of the wall, of course, and conditions were warming up. And we had a mini triathlon there. And so the Russians, the first student they send, who did they send? But I mean, this was a Spetsnaz stud. This guy built and swear everything. Right? So the swimming leg goes great. He's doing fantastic. We knew he'd be great in the run. But unfortunately, the bike broke down and carrying it for the rest of the run, and it typified, wow, all heart, but you need the equipment to manage the lessons that you take out of these. The other thing that came out of that is this was during the all-volunteer General Staff College, and I got Chief's Staff Group. I didn't know what that was at the time. I was naive, and General with him. He was. So I came in to interview for the day. The day started at 6 in the morning. It was the same night as the president's inaugural address. I got out of work at 8 p.m. and I'm just thinking, this is a lot of work. But it was really cool to see the lights of the Washington Monument. You could see the Capitol in the background, and I thought, this could be cool. But I also had the chance to interview with the skunks in the Pentagon, and I decided that I'd want to work for the skunks rather than in the chief staff group, just more my deal of work and strategy. What I didn't realize is that what Colonel Fogelsong at that time wanted, he got. And so it didn't matter what I put down. I went to work for him, and it was so neat. It's the opportunity you don't imagine. I ended up at a certain point in the room with the chief of staff and the next chief of staff, and they're having very frank one-on-one conversations, and I'm a fly on the wall. And so the point clearly that I'm making is in just a couple of months, some of you are going to be in that situation. You're going to be that major or lieutenant colonel who has the chance to hear at the very highest level, not just what are we going to do, but why are we going to do it and the rationale behind it. I came back to Pentagon in one of my other 5 trips back, And I was preparing to brief the chairman, and it was at the time that the North Koreans were threatening a Taepodong launch, and so we were going through the whole integrated threat warning and attack assessment and the chains behind that. And it was going to, the timelines are very tight. And I had a lieutenant colonel advising me, and I'm talking to the chairman, and no kidding, 30 minutes later, the chairman's talking to the president and laying this out for him. And so the opportunity you are going to have this year to gain understanding about how we do business in the Air Force and then use that at some of the highest levels, I just don't think you fully grasp the impact that you're going to have. I was in a briefing just yesterday with a lieutenant colonel briefing our chief on Russia and Syria and what our policy should be so that the chief can go into the tank session and talk about that. And so your impact will be huge, which is another way of saying you might want to listen up this year. Rather than my philosophy, it's only a lot of reading if you do it. It's a lot of good reading if you do it, and I really do recommend it to you. And I'm closing out now 34 years of service. I'm on my 2-month countdown, which means that I don't mind telling a joke. So, so 2 very good men passed away, and they go up to heaven. And unfortunately, the computer system was down. And so St. Peter said, you've all been very good. I don't know how long it's going to take. Tell you what, I'm going to send you back to Earth. And you can go back as anything you want. And so the first man said, I'd really like to be an eagle soaring over the Rocky Mountains with incredible vision so that I could spot something at a great distance, and the greatest of all birds. And St. Peter said, sure. And boom, away he goes. And the second guy kind of, you know what? I've always wanted to be a stud. Would that be okay? And St. Peter says, well, okay, boom, and away he goes. So the next morning they fix the computer system, and St. Peter calls on an angel to go get the 2 gentlemen. And the angel said, well, how will I find them? And St. Peter said, well, the first guy is going to be easy. You just go to the Rocky Mountains, you look up, and you'll see this eagle soaring majestically over the Rockies. The second one, that's going to be a little tougher. He's up in Montana somewhere embedded in a snow tire. You all thought I was going to tell a dirty joke. Okay, so what I am here to talk to you about is the future of ISR. And I'm going to lay this out in 5 slides, because if I go more than 5 slides, I'm going to lose you. I may lose you anyway. But what I want to do is just lay this out in a way that may make sense to you. And what I would tell you is a lot of people think of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and they think of what we do through the distributed ground system, or they think about remotely piloted airplanes, or let's call it what it is, drones. That's what everyone else calls it. And that's really not the case. And what I want to lay out to you is how we can look at this. But first of all, I just need to do a poll. How many of you are post 9/11? Are we there yet? That came in on active duty after 9/11? Yeah, wow, that's really cool. But it also means that foundationally, as I think through what I address here, that affects my perspective and what I might talk about. Let's go to the first slide. So I think we can talk about challenges to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is falling into 4 broad bins. And we can talk about these really at length, and I'll just use this as a format. So the first one is, so if we look at the disciplines in intelligence, collection, analysis, targeting, and processing, exploitation, dissemination, those are the 4 major subsets, a great way to detail what we do in ISR. The first one is, under collection, that we are air domain centric. Air domain centric. That's not a surprise, right? If you look at our roots, if you look at our history, and the way that we have developed, and the challenge with it is that not only are we air domain centric, but we're also oriented more on the permissive side of the spectrum rather than the anti-access side. And so one of the things that's happening as we've emphasized the permissive side is our potential adversaries are learning that, oh, hey, I know how to defeat a drone, and they'll set up tents so that you can't see them. Or I know how to defeat a drone. I'm not going to use cell phones and electronics. And now they're back to semaphore waving flags, which is pretty cool because it degrades their capability. So if we look at ISR more holistically and we talk about, well, what about from space? And what we realize is really there's two agencies, the NRO and the National Security Agency, who heavily use space. NGA uses space, but less so in our Air Force. And so what we find is intelligence from space is not as well integrated with the other domains as we would like it to be. And it leads to a duplication of effort. So here's an example. We had one of our SHARP collection managers who kept track for a quarter of the number of times that we ordered imagery from a U2, and then the number of times that it was duplicated through our national means. And more than 50% of the time, there was duplication during that quarter. Now, that wouldn't be a problem if it were intentional, but what tends to happen is people order both, knowing that for sure they'll get the U2. If they got the overhead, that'd be great. And so it's needless duplication that isn't adding to our intelligence. Another factor is, as we try to integrate space into and air into our operations to create intelligence, is we find a lack of understanding of how to harness the assets in space, except by people who have already had those assignments, or a lack of understanding how to harness the cyber domain in order to integrate that intelligence. And so collection suffers as a result of that. And so the point that I would make is I believe that there's also intelligence for space, and we are accepting risk in the space domain that we would not accept from the air domain. And of course you can understand the roots for that if you go back in time, space was pretty much uncontested and for the most part not concerned about warfare in space. Now we see certainly what the Russians and the Chinese are doing, and you hear General Hyten talking about space is increasingly congested and contested, and it's no longer the sanctuary that it used to be. But what we haven't done is grown the intelligence for space as we work through that, as well as being able to harness intelligence from space into our operations. I have traveled through Southern California and visited some of the commercial companies that are dealing in space. And it's exciting. I mean, there are companies that are talking about imaging the entire planet once a day. And if you could stitch together all of the commercial imagery, you can see how you might be able to get 7-minute pastimes, 7 to 10-minute pastimes over a point on the planet, say, Nellis. And so now think through that from indications and warning standpoint. Have we got any B2 folks in here? So you're taxiing your B2 out from Whiteman, and the time it takes you to get through the end of the runway checks and pull the pins on your bombs is greater than the pass time of a satellite to pass over and image it. And so the idea of surprise now takes on whole new meaning, and the opportunity for trained spies like me to be able to harness that. So the second point is limited sensor standoff in collection. So if we look at certainly the Russians have been very adept, the Chinese as well, but I talked to the Russians, is developing the advanced SAM systems. So I often talk to audiences in Washington, D.C. The Russians are developing SAM systems that will reach out from Washington, D.C. to Dayton, Ohio. Think about that in terms of reach. And now what does that mean for collection platforms, airborne collection platforms, that might have to collect outside of those range rings, and the demand for a sensor to have that kind of acuity. And you quickly see that based on the limited sensor standoff, that it might suggest that we'd want to rely more on space or cyberspace for some of our collection. And then that leads to the third point, which is a restricted find, fix, target, track, engage, assess capability. And the reality is what we struggle to do is to hold targets of interest. And our potential adversaries have learned that, and that's why you're seeing them work on mobile threat systems. If you think about mobile tactical ballistic missiles or mobile long-range SAM systems. The reason they're doing that is to make it much more difficult to do the find and fix piece of this, because the reality is, pretty much today, if we can find it and fix it, we're going to kill it, us or our partners. And so they've got to complicate the find and the fix, and that's why you're seeing the proliferation of SAR jammers. We use radar to image the terrain, the radar imagery, the techniques behind that have become very, very good. So we can do a great job to find and fix, but not in a SAR jamming environment. That's why you're seeing the development of denial and deception and the use of decoys in order to frustrate, is it real or is it fake? And sometimes that takes, some very well-trained analysts in order to discern that and requires additional collection techniques for us to do it. Targeting. So it shouldn't be a secret that we lack the throughput on targeting that we'd like to have. We've been frustrated with that over time. If you look broadly across the services, across all of the services, there was a disinvestment in targeting, except for the Air Force. The combatant commands decided to take risk in this area. I'm broadly speaking, I'm painting a broad brush. And so we can't scale our targeting capacity the way that we would like. An indication of that is when ISIL was tracking down to Baghdad and we needed to get involved in Iraq again, we have a targeting team at Shaw Air Force Base, which is where our Air Force's Central Command are. And they deployed forward as a gap filler, right, in August, and thinking that the next rotation they'd be relieved. Well, they were there for almost a year, until the spring before we could get targeteers to them. We just lack the capacity of trained teams in order to send to them. If you look at the velocity of targets, when we did Desert Storm the second time, we were taking out 1,000 targets a day. And if you look at our capacity today, we're taking out on the order of 50 a day or less. Now, some of that is, of course, what I talked about before, the ability to frustrate our targeting and the certainty and our willingness to accept civilian casualties. But just if you think about that as a throughput and a metric, I don't think that our targeting today would enable us to reach those kinds of capacities. For one thing, our processes are pretty constipated. They take 72 hours to build a target folder on a single target if we don't accept risk, if we do it the way the process describes today. Just the checking of targets takes much longer than what we would expect. And so what we need to do is figure out a different way to do that. And then that's kinetically. What about non-kinetically? We really lack the teams that can harness the non-kinetic capability. A couple of years ago, when I was the commander of the Air Force ISR agency, I called the targeting center and I said, "Hey, I want to send you a cyber guy." And they said, "Well, why would you do that?" And I said, "Well, because we need to work on non-kinetic targeting." And I had to sell them on the idea that they needed this capability, and I was giving them the body just as kind of to tease them into understanding what they were missing. And so there's no question that today we have very little non-kinetic targeting capability and capacity. And then there's poor integration of it when we do have it. So how many of you have done KAOC assignments? Yeah, enough of you to know this. So, we'd go upstairs and we'd do the briefing, and then we'd go downstairs into the green door in order to get the non-kinetic briefing, right? And so we put this capability, because it tends to be SAP'd or top secret, behind a door, which hinders the very integration that we're trying to achieve. And if you look at capacity then overall, what you see is, it just falls short. What else do I want to say? I think that was it. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say, non-kinetically. So we are building out under Cyber Command the cyber mission teams and the national mission teams. It is We will often reach some of the combatant commanders' top priorities with those forces. We often don't reach the demands from the air component. And so what we see is airmen, those sorts of targets that we would be interested in, which might include aspects of an integrated air defense system, are challenged in the priority system because we don't have enough capacity, essentially, to go after it. Analysis. So essentially our analytic tradecraft has atrophied. I did a survey of our squadron commanders in the intelligence business, and I just asked them, said, what's your confidence that we have the analytic capacity to handle a high-end fight? And the response was, we're not very confident at all. And that became well known then when we did the shift to Syria, and we were scrambling, quite frankly, at some of our analytic sites in order to have analysts who really understood the details necessary in order to determine an air order battle and where those assets might have moved. Because it's atrophied. Because we're really, really good at doing this low-end permissive HVI hunting and doing the analysis that supports predators and reapers. But because we're putting so much effort there, it has hindered our ability to exercise and maintain those high-end skills against the most difficult potential adversaries. The second point is we have an inadequate tool suite for them to use. So I just traveled to the KOC recently in the springtime, and one of the top two things that General Brown asked me for, he said, look, we really need better tool suites for our analysts. Right now they're using spreadsheets and they're cobbling stuff together and they're inventing their own, and we need something that pulls all this together. And then the final thing is intel mission data, which many of you may not have heard of, but essentially that is the data that makes an F-35 really, really sexy. So as you know, that platform is really a great sensor, and it collects incredible amounts of data through various means. But in order for its computers to work fully, the data bank needs to be full. In order for the data bank to be full, we've got to have all kinds of measurements of not just red systems, those systems we think we might end up fighting, both in the air and on the ground and on the sea, but also gray systems, those systems that could swing either way because of, the technology has been sold to a country that may be on our side, maybe won't be on our side. And then also those platforms that we know aren't going to be involved in the fighting, but we sure as heck don't want to shoot. And so to be able to separate that. And so the red data, the white data, the blue data, and the gray data is all stuff that needs to be compiled. And that data for the F-35 is like 7 times what we needed for the F-22. Which is just orders of magnitude more than what we needed for the F-15. And so it's just an effort thing. And we know how to get the data. There's just so much of it. And then the final thing is PED, or processing, exploitation, and dissemination. And really here it's the lack of multi-domain integration. We're really good at airborne PED. If it's the U-2 or the Global Hawk or the MQ-1 or the MQ-9 or the MC-12, we got it. And it's great. But if we were trying to integrate stuff from space, that's a much harder to do. And if we're trying to integrate cyber, that's a much harder to do. It's very nascent. And so the second point, our info architectures are antiquated. So the system that we use grew out of essentially the first Gulf War, back around the time you were all born, sadly. And it was the linking of U-2 to a van on the ground, and this was really groundbreaking, right? That we had the data in country and we could disseminate it quickly. And now we do it with reachback. And so the information architecture that supports that is pretty exquisite. And so we talk about globally networked, regionally focused. but updating it is a mess. And so it took us 7 years and almost $1 billion to upgrade it the last time that we did it. And when we fielded it 7 years later, the analysts said, well, I like the old stuff better, which was really quite an indictment, right, on our acquisition process and what we had done. And so then we said, well, let's take a best of breed then between the old and the new. And that has taken us 4 to 5 years to get to. And so what we know is this proprietary model doesn't work. We need to get to an open architecture. And then I already mentioned the permissive ops focus. If I were going to guess, I would say that about 80% of the discussion by the President's National Security Team focuses on counterterrorism and terrorism. About 20% focuses on those threats that are truly existential to our country. And so, funding priorities flow from that, OCO funding flows from that, and that hinders our ability to modernize. Next slide. Okay, so what is ISR going to look like in the future? If we look at, you all I know have read or you will read the Strategic Master Plan. Is that part of your assigned reading? I hope so. If not, you'll want to read that on a Saturday just because it's so interesting. And the future operational concept of how we're going to run our Air Force, these documents are important. And in these documents, it outlines what we're going to do to the future. And really, there's 3 vectors that I think are important for you to take away. One is we're going to rebalance towards the high-end contested environments for reasons that we've already discussed. The second is we're going to build a multi-domain across the range of military operation force and the intelligence that supports that. And the third is we're going to enable this global vigilance, reach, and power, and a decision advantage. So we just came out as an Air Force with the Air Superiority 2030, which was an enterprise-wide collaborative team that looked at the threats we're going to face between now and 2030 and what we need to do to deal with that. And there's an intelligence piece of this that what I see in the future is ISR and C2 coming closer together, and because it's all about the decision advantage. It's all John Boyd in the OODA loop. Are you going to read John Boyd this year? It's a good book. Another Saturday reading if you haven't done that. And so let me show you what I mean if you go to the next slide. So this is what our enterprise is going to look like. This is what we're modeling. And if I can draw your attention to the right side of this slide, this is the reason I'm going to try to steal this pointer and leave with it. But it starts with the tactical side, right? And that doesn't have to be an airplane. That could be a satellite. But at the tactical level, and then the operational level, this is supposed to be a command center like a KOC, and then looking at what the combatant commands want, what they do is develop priority intel requirements, questions that they want answers. And those questions should drive all of our analysis. And so this key is representative of the ISR enterprise here, and then that globe represents sensors. I don't care whether it's a subsurface sensor, a space sensor, an airborne sensor, cyber. What is it that can get at the data that answers the question that the warfighter's looking for, whether that's a tactical, operational, or strategic level? And the key to this then is for these sensors to have their data conditioned in a way that whether it's, think of that as a sensor array, it goes into a cloud, and that data is discoverable. So this is not just fantasy. There is something called the Intelligence Community Information Technology Enterprise, or ISITE. And that approach, JWICs only, unfortunately, we're arguing that. That approach is going to provide the opportunity for us to do things differently in the future. And if we can get there, and there's a lot of work to make that happen, then what I imagine is we do our exploitation multi-int, all source. It supports analysis, it supports targeting, it answers those questions, and we have a different mix of intelligence people tomorrow than we have today, because we're going to have many more that are all source. So next slide. So what does this look like in terms of an enterprise way ahead? So for collection, what we want to do is clearly integrate from all of the domains. And that starts, we've got some efforts. We have structured object management right now, or SOM, which is structuring data so that it can be displayed either graphically, geographically, or temporally in a way that makes the data very obvious, right? So imagine you're looking at a map, you go, I'm interested in activity here, and you can click and get all of the activity that occurs in that space. That only happens if you condition the data so that you can do that. We've got what's called the CMCC, which is a experiment. And in the CMCC, what we've pursued with some of our main aircraft manufacturers is the idea of an open architecture. And through an open architecture, then we can have applications that would work, whether it is Boeing, whether it's Northrop, whether it's Lockheed, that we would be able to integrate in ways that we have been unable to do so far today. And so this is a test center to see, does that stuff really work? And we took a sensor off of a U-2 and we integrated it on a platform, and it worked beautifully by the second flight. Something that would have taken months before. So there's an investment up front, and then at the tail end of that investment, you can iterate very, very, very quickly, and that's going to allow us to get inside the OODA loop. So great promise for that as we look to the future. There's also an example with overhead persistent IR, which many of you probably hadn't heard of or necessarily care about, but think of a steering sensor in space that has the ability to detect heat illuminations. And with this OPIR data, we've found the ability to pipe it all, the whole shebang from the Cobra Brass sensor over to our National Air and Space Intelligence Center. And they have experts that plow through and create the algorithms that can say, okay, that's what this is. And because it's a steering sensor, it gives you the persistence that we've lacked before. So another example of how we're tying space now into this. We've got to work more on the cyber piece of that. For targeting, we're working on creating some teams of targeteers that would train together, organize together, deploy together. So one focused on the Pacific, one focused on the Europe, one focused on Central, but they might be in a rotational base. So we always have those forces ready to go. And that would be not just the targeting, but also the target development and the analytics that support that. We're looking at new tools for them. We're launching training for them so that we're reinvesting in some courses that we had allowed to lapse, because we believe that in the targeting area, a lot of what we got to do is to just foundationally work on the tradecraft. And then we're going to harness some tools that the National Geospatial Agency is coming out with that, as you can imagine with technology today, it shouldn't be a 4-hour deal to come up with some points that we can bomb. And so we've got software that's very good that we're going to be able to field that's going to enable that. For analysis, we really need to incorporate some big data analytics, and we're a long way off from being able to do that. But what we want to get is using technology so that we don't scale one-to-one with the platform. So right now, if we have a U-2 that's flying, I've got a crew that attends that from the ground as intel analysts, and that just doesn't scale. Because if you look at tomorrow and we've got a proliferation of small unmanned airplanes, drones, how do you get the intelligence from that? And you can't dedicate a team to it. And so we're looking at different processes that are going to allow us to do that. AFRL is leading the way on tools. So if you think of even watching the drones and the full motion video, how do we get automated alerts when a certain activity happens so that we're not staring at that thing the same time, the entire time? We're looking at ways to use the speech to text in ways that we haven't to this point. So we have speech to text. It's called Human Language Translator, and for some languages, like Spanish, it's pretty good. It's equivalent to a 2-2 speaker. If you had taken Spanish all the way from, say, 8th grade through 12th grade, At a really good high school, you might be 2-2 in Spanish, right? So it really cuts down the timelines required to do that. But it learns as it goes along. And we've got it for some of the main languages. We need to now get to some of the obscure languages because that's where a lot of our operations take place. And so the science behind that is exquisite. AFRL is working on some of that. And then we need to analyze the human factors so that if I have a team of 7 doing something, why can't it be a team of 5 because of a different approach? And so we want people who are experts in the science of human behavior that can help us lean out some of our processes so that we can do that better as well. And then the big data analytics. What my heart says on this one, or at least the way that I lean, is we will never have the capability to do big data the way that the commercial companies do. So, I log on the internet now, and I'm getting all kinds of stuff for retirees. And how do they know I'm retiring in 2 months? And the point is they have my cyber persona, right? And they're tracking me. And they're looking at my clicks. And from that, they are figuring out what they want to advertise to me. Think of that potential in terms of understanding the world and connecting the dots and being able to tell the president, hey, we think we're going to have some unrest in country X in about 2 weeks based on what you're collecting through big data. We do not have that expertise. And when I've gone out to Microsoft and asked them, how do you guys do this? What they typically do is they'll have a team. And any physicists in here? So, yeah, they always hire physicists, right? Because PhD physicists, what the hell do you do with that degree? So they're pretty cheap. And so they can get them at a low price, but they have exquisite problem-solving capabilities. And so they'll have a couple physicists, and they'll have a computer scientist, and they'll have a behavioral scientist, and they'll have all of these PhDs as a team that can approach problems. And so one of the examples they gave is they were working with an elevator company, and the elevator company wanted to go to different processes on maintenance, and they were able to show them how they could save $100 per elevator per year. I know what you're thinking. What's the big deal? Well, this company works on so many elevators, it saved them $1.4 billion in their first year. And that's using big data to really lean things out on a fine scale. They also worked on cow Fitbits. You didn't know that cows had Fitbits. Not all of them do, but at least this one rancher who had a lot of cows, thought that it would make sense to put, and I call it a Fitbit, it probably isn't, but it's gauging their steps and their temperature and all that kind of stuff. And by doing that, they were able to determine behavior patterns that meant sick cow. So now, instead of supplying the preemptively drugs to the cows so that they never got sick, what you do is you just pull out a cow when they're demonstrating that they're getting sick, and then you give that one cow medicine, and then you can sell all the rest of that cow meat at a really high price because you haven't drugged them. So there's a commercial application here that we'll never be able to replicate in the intelligence business, but would be really cool to harness. And so what I see us doing is harnessing that kind of talent, through contracts so that we can get some analytics focused on what we need to do. And then finally on PED. So what we need to do is empower millennial innovation. And the path that we're going down is an open architecture. And we've had a tremendous resistance to this originally. Quite frankly, the challenges that we faced were as much about personalities, the human element, as it was about going down the path. So we ended up having to find the people who really believed in it and empowering them. And what we've been able to do is in a short period of time field our first open architecture backbone for this system, and then we're going to deploy it later on this year into a main site at Beale and also a guard site. And once we have that open architecture, the next thing we're going to add is the SIGINT piece of this. It's called Agile Enclave, but it's going to be the ability to then harness all of the tools that the National Security Agency has invested in. So if you just think about that, the Air Force, we're a bit player really in the SIGINT world compared to the National Security Agency. Why wouldn't we want to be able to harness their tools? But we can only do that if we have this open architecture, so that we can, and that'll save us probably $1 billion in intellectual capital. So that's what we're doing. And what we hope to have by 2025 is something that's really different than what we see today. Can you go to the last slide before we go to Q&A? I thought I had, I guess I don't have a last slide. After lunch, I'm speaking with the ISR Research Task Force to discuss ways to further focus in on this and close these gaps. And what you can see is they're going to have their work cut out for them. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of work forward. But there are challenges, and challenges can be conquered. And I think of 1964, Dick Fosbury. He was a jumper in Oregon, and a mediocre jumper. But in '63, he developed a new technique to jump that we all know today as the Fosbury flop. And so when he entered in the '64 Olympics, really as an unknown jumper out of Oregon, he ended up winning the gold medal and setting a world record. And so after that happened, guess what the silver and bronze medalists did for the '68 Olympics? Yeah, you're right. They stuck with what they were doing because they were that close. But all of the other jumpers that finished out of the competition decided, hey, maybe there's something to this Fosbury flop. And so they picked up that technique. And if you watch the Olympics this year, everybody did the Fosbury flop. So why do I tell you that story? Because the challenge for you as students is to figure out when there's something really unique and something that we all need to run to, and then other times when we need to disregard it. And if you do it right, you're Dick Fosbury, and you end up as the world champion. And if you do it wrong in defense, you have a really, really bad day. Okay, so final story. So, like I will in 2 months, a guy was retiring, and he got this big bouquet of flowers, and he's looking at these flowers, and it said, "I'm sorry for your loss." And so he called the florist, and he said, "Hey, really neat flowers, but I didn't understand the card that said, 'Sorry for your loss.'" And the florist just got apoplectic. I mean, the florist was beside herself, apologizing, but stumbling and stammering. And he said, "Hey, it's not that big a deal, honestly." And she said, "Oh, you don't understand. Somewhere out there, there's a funeral with a card that says, 'Congratulations, you've earned it.'" And so my message to all of you is, it's really selective to go to the Air Command and Staff College. This is a neat year for you. It's a year to think. And there's not nearly enough thinking going on in the Pentagon because we're all too busy running from meeting to meeting. Congratulations. You have earned this year, and I hope that you make the most out of it. And 23 years from now, you'll be standing on the stage talking to a next group. Thank you very much. Oh no, sit down. We're not done yet. We got 17 minutes, and we're going to use every minute of it. But I appreciate all the respect.
Sir, this is Major Carlson, Flight 9. You spoke a lot about open source architecture.